our discussion to celebrate the release of Coded Bias. As you saw by that incredible trailer, Coded Bias is really celebrating the need for more people to get involved and to build a better tech future, especially when we talk about the development and deployment of artificial intelligence. Really excited about the discussion that we have for today. I'll be your host for this discussion. My name is David Ryan Polgar. I'm with the organization called All Tech is Human. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, we're all about building the pipeline for responsible tech. You can check us out at alltechishuman.org. We also recently released a responsible tech guide at responsibletechguide.com that's all about including more people, because really that's what I'm hoping we discuss and touch upon today, that we need more people involved, more voices, more diversity, more diverse opinions to build a better tech future. So I've got an incredible panel. As I mentioned, we have the director of Coded Bias, Shalini Kantaya, who's going to be joining us. And we also have Timnit Gebru, and welcome, as they're popping up on screen. Timnit is the co-lead of Ethical Artificial Intelligence team at Google. And I'm sure if you are familiar with this AI space around ethics, you're familiar with her work, and also familiar with the work of Meredith Broussard, who's been on All Tech is Human podcast. So welcome back. Meredith is the author of Artificial Unintelligence and also a professor at NYU. So welcome, everyone, to our discussion. We have an hour together, and I also want to prompt anybody who's tuning in to ask us some questions, and we'll try to incorporate them in the discussion. So, Shalini, I want to start off with you, because when we're watching this film, it kind of fits within the, I guess, the maybe the section that you might see, like The Great Hack, or right now, also on Netflix, you have The Social Dilemma. But when I watched Coded Bias, it seems a little different. In particular, all of the voices that you feature are women, and then also a good percentage of women, a person of color. So I'm just curious, when you tackle this film, Coded Bias, because obviously a film takes a great deal of planning and preparation to get done. I'm curious about your motivation behind Coded Bias, and also, what are you hoping to accomplish with this release that we're celebrating this weekend? What are you hoping that people really take away?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, David. I just want to cordially welcome everyone to the New York Theatrical Premiere of Coded Bias. I am absolutely thrilled to finally be able to share the voices in this film with you. I want to especially thank the Metrograph Theater in my home city of New York for giving us this incredible platform to have this, to share the film and to have the conversation, and just say how much I miss seeing your faces. And I can't wait to be back in the cinema with you, especially one as cool as the Metrograph. So thank you all for being here and making time to engage in this conversation. I like 2 years ago, I didn't know what an algorithm was. I think every
now you do. Now you're deeply involved now.
Yes, I've spent a little bit of time thinking about it between then and now. But I think I was a sci-fi fanatic. I'm a filmmaker and a sci-fi fanatic, and everything I knew about AI was sort of from the mind of Stanley Kubrick or Steven Spielberg, this kind of imagination about artificial intelligence. And I love tech, and a lot of all of my work in some ways has to do with disruptive technologies and how they impact the marginalized, whether they make the world more fair or less fair, and for whom. And so I sort of stumbled upon a TED Talk by Joy Buolamwini and read the book Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill, and then subsequently a book called Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble, and subsequently Artificial Unintelligence by Meredith Broussard, and sort of stumbled down this rabbit hole of this sort of dark underbelly of big tech. And I think that what was so alarming to me in the making of this film is I did not really realize the extent to which human beings were already outsourcing our autonomy to machines, making such decisions about who gets what quality of health care, who gets hired, how long a prison sentence someone serves. And I sort of stumbled my way in because even though all of my films have been somewhat political, they always start with a character. And for me, it was with Joy Buolamwini and her discovery of racial bias in artificial intelligence. And through that sort of uncover widespread bias throughout. And sort of what I realized in the making of this film is that this is where the battle for civil rights will happen in the 21st century, I believe, because every sector of civil society will be transformed by AI, is already being transformed by AI. And so I'm really grateful to the sort of brilliant and badass cast of the film for sort of giving us an education. People like Meredith and Taneeth, who are really bridge people who are able to break down, who have like the magic power, the magic superpower of the scientific method in order to like sort of understand these systems and how they work, and yet have this other perspective as someone who maybe was not, whose experience wasn't always centered, was, you know, somehow on the margins. And because of that, has this sensitivity, has this empathy, has this humanity, this perspective that they're bringing to AI. And so I'm really grateful because I feel like the film was such a challenge to sort of discern these brilliant data scientists and mathematicians and journalists and activists, and trying to break down the science and also connect it to the people whose lives this has real implications for opportunity and for civil rights. And so what was the second part of your question?
Well, that was great right there. We're also talking about, especially with the theatrical release right now. What are you hoping that people really? We should celebrate, but what are you hoping that people really take away?
I'm so grateful to this cast for the education that they gave me, and I'm so grateful to be able to share a story about the technologies that will define our future, told predominantly through the lens of women and people of color. I feel like we have had this spectacular lack of imagination about these technologies and how they can be used because they've been developed, and even our imagination and our stories and our science fiction around them have been developed by a small group of people. And I think for me, I feel like I learned that there are other ways that this can work besides surveillance capitalism. There are other models, and the people on this panel can talk a little bit much more extent about that. But I will say that I feel honored and privileged to share the stories in the film because they're stories of everyday people who are making real change in the world. And it's my hope that people, I'm so grateful to be able to share the film with the public, because it's my hope that people will feel empowered to talk about, that they don't have to have an advanced degree to talk about these technologies that influence us all. And also that it will engage people to be active citizens in, and sort of making sure that that AI and codes are our values, our democratic values. And I'm so grateful to this panel because everyone on this panel is actively involved in building a culture that honors the inherent value of every human being in technology, somehow in technology. And so that's what I'm sort of very interested in, is how we use ethics and inclusion to extend human rights culture into tech,
Yeah.
how we
Well, and I certainly want to do my part to congratulate you, because definitely in my space with All Tech is Human, I've seen firsthand the importance to have some type of common experience, especially like a film like this, where people can really talk about some of these issues. And that's actually where I want to take this conversation. It really reminds me of something that I heard Meredith you say on an earlier discussion around coded bias, and you were talking about your background as a journalist, and that issues around algorithmic bias and some of the issues that we deal with, freedom of mind and social media, they're oftentimes hard to illustrate. And then, especially also, Shalini, as a filmmaker, you're trying to kind of showcase a story and then get the viewer involved. It seems like a lot of these issues are always very tricky to create a visualization, right? It seems like when we have AI, we have to show a picture of Pepper the robot or Sophia the robot or Terminator, right? So we sometimes lack an ability to kind of visualize this, which is important, because visualization creates maybe a potential need of why we need to do something. Like for climate change, we can actually see melting ice caps, or we can see the harm that's being done. So Meredith, would love to hear your opinion about this. Is if we're talking about actually improving the status quo, getting more people actively involved in this space, what do you think we can do to build upon the release of Coded Bias to help people understand the importance of a lot of these issues? Because I think to a lot of people, they almost assume that technology is outside of human control, that it's something that maybe pops down from the heavens, set it and forget it, Ron Popeil style. But in fact, as you point out, we're encoding our own human biases inside of the technology. And that's also why even All Tech is Human, that's why we even chose that name, to keep that sense of agency. So Meredith, and then Anthony, I'll bring you in on this discussion. Love to hear what you think we can do moving forward.
So thanks for having me first. And in terms of talking about technology, lots of people are intimidated by technology. They feel like technology is something that they have to kind of, close their eyes and accept it, or like it's medicine you have to take. But we have a voice in creating technology. And we have a voice in creating technology that, as Shalini said, is consistent with our democratic values, with our values as a society. And so as a data journalist, I'm very committed to empowering people to understand how technology works, how it doesn't work for many populations, and helping people to understand that you have a voice. I think one of the things that Shalini does beautifully in the film is she brings to life these very complicated issues, because artificial intelligence is hard to understand. I used to go to, say, a cocktail party, and people would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'd say, "Oh, I work on algorithmic ethics." And 3 years ago, this would get you like a blank stare, and maybe the person would like wander off. Like, it's a relief that now you can say, "Oh, I work on algorithmic ethics," and people are like, "Oh yeah, I have heard of that." So the techlash has really taken hold. People are thinking about socio-technical issues as being very nuanced. And so I'm really pleased that that Coded Bias is out there now, and that it offers us so many opportunities to talk about decisions that are being made on our behalf using technology that are not necessarily decisions that we agree with.
And then Tim Neat, you're currently at Google, formerly also with Microsoft, and then you have Meredith, who's at NYU. Sometimes there seems to be a gap between academia and industry. With a lot of your work, how do you think we can go about kind of operationalizing AI ethics?
So, I had given a talk recently at a conference called a symposium called Baylearn, and my keynote was about the hierarchy of knowledge. So my keynote was about the hierarchy of knowledge in machine learning and its consequences. And so what I mean by that is in technology. So going back to your question, what Meredith said and Shalini said, why are people intimidated, or why aren't so many people involved, or why are some of the why is some of the scholarship that especially Black women have been doing for a long time, why has it been sidelined? And I think it's because of the hierarchy of knowledge, and that comes in many forms, right? So I was listening to this conversation with Ruha and Meredith, where Ruha was saying that there's so many coding camps for I'm sorry, yeah, there's so many coding camps. We always talk about how we always have to have coding camps, but I've never heard of like a social science camp for technologists or computer scientists or something like that, right? And it's true. And you're not, there is this hierarchy of knowledge, and there's a certain way that you have to be in there. People call the view from nowhere. And so even if you have certain intuitions and a certain lived experience and certain things you want to bring to the table, you're discouraged from completely doing that, because then you become discredited. And so for me, it took me a long time to, oh, sorry, I was just distracted by that chat. And then I like my dog right here. But for me, it took me a very long time to kind of go past that and be like, okay, whatever, I have my pedigrees and stuff, so you can't discredit me. But that to me is, so the reason I wanted to bring this up is that I don't necessarily believe the dichotomy between academia and industry is that big, because there is an underlying foundation that comes from both, where you learn this hierarchy of knowledge in academia. And many of the researchers in industry go back and forth. Their students are interns in industry, then they do grants together, and things like that. So I don't see this dichotomy as much. There's this underlying foundational paradigm, I think, that exists in both places that, in my opinion, is problematic. And so even when people talk about how to regulate industry or how to move forward or something like that, many times I don't see the difference between academics versus people in industry. I see it more as disciplinary differences, or it could be like people of color or the Black women who've been working on this for so long versus others. So that's sort of how I feel about that. And so in terms of operationalizing it, I think there are a number of things. One of the things I'm actually trying to do in my team is bring in knowledge from people like Meredith, and people who are not usually, at the tech companies, because either there is not, historically, either they've been considered like as enemies or something like that, or not the typical, white male coder kind of thing. And it's been really hard to do that, but we finally at least have a number of people on our team bringing that kind of perspective. And then the question is how to make sure that their knowledge is considered equal to everybody else's knowledge. And then there's other, like, just process-oriented things, some other technical things. But for me, that is for me the foundation. Okay. That hierarchy of knowledge is the foundation.
Yeah. And then Meredith, I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm going to start incorporating some of our audience questions. So again, for anybody listening, please just send us over your questions. We'll try to incorporate as many as we can. But Meredith, as I mentioned, have a background as a journalist. How do you think that background informs your current thinking about AI ethics, specifically around algorithmic bias, and then how you wrote your book? How do you think this has kind of shaped your worldview? Because there's a lot of talk about incorporating more multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary type of thinking.
So I actually started my career as a computer scientist, and I quit to become a journalist. And I worked at an elite tech firm, and I quit because of all of the textbook reasons that you hear about that push women out of STEM careers. And it was a while ago, more years ago than I care to admit. And it was a different time. I am so heartened by the fact that today we have people like Tim Neat leading the charge inside tech companies and doing amazing work and bringing in women, bringing in people of color, talking about intersectional issues, because that was not the case when I started my career. I became a journalist because the gender balance was better in journalism, and because I could do interdisciplinary work. So as a data journalist, what I do is I tell stories with numbers. I use numbers to tell stories, and I write code. I write AI systems in order to commit acts of investigative journalism. So it's very, very interdisciplinary. And I like it because I get to draw on social science. I get to draw on machine learning, and I get to discern truth wherever it happens to be. Joy's project that Shalini follows in the film is a particular inspiration because Joy brings together so many different disciplines. She's an artist, she's a poet, she's a musician, she's a computer scientist, she's an amazing thinker. And you really have to think on multiple different levels in order to bring together all of the strands that go into a research project like Joy did. And then to go back to what Timnit mentioned before, Joy's doing this against a backdrop of, well, let's just say it, like against a backdrop of racism and sexism in the discipline. So there is indeed a hierarchy of knowledge. One of the dirty secrets of mathematicians is that mathematicians can be terrible snobs. There's this privileging of mathematical ways of thinking over, say, qualitative ways of thinking. And this stretches back centuries. There's also an image of who can be a mathematician. It's mostly white men. And then computer science is a descendant of mathematics. And so computer science has this snobbiness as well. And we can see the gender bias and the racial bias of elite math reflected in elite computer science. And the elite computer scientists are the people leading the big tech companies today. So it's a kind of inequality that gets reproduced inside corporations that comes from academia, as Timnit said, and it's something that we do need to address in order to make a better world with technology.
Yeah, well, and then hopefully that's with the release of Coded Bias, making a big difference. And that's one of the questions that we're going to incorporate pretty soon. But Timnit, one of the scenes of Coded Bias that really struck me was a scene that was between Joy, Deb, and then I think you were on Skype or Google Meet or something. And really in that scene, unfortunately, even though you had this incredibly important research that was being presented, the discussion was that being a person in color kind of put all of the research kind of in a more difficult position to have it gain traction. So have you noticed any changes over the past couple of years? And if not, what do you think really needs to be done? And obviously Coded Bias is one important step in this.
I've seen, I have to be a little bit optimistic for a second or before, because things are not great, but I have seen a big amount of change in the last couple of years. And first of all, I know a lot more people who've been working on this for a very long time now, like Meredith, right? When I met Joy, I think we met in 2016 or something like that. Neither of us had known about each other or something. The only thing I knew was that Joy was doing this this TED Talk. She had this TED Talk. And I'm like, oh my God, I want to work with you on whatever you're doing. And, she was doing a master's at MIT at that time. It was basically me and her, and I was advising her as a PhD student at Stanford. I didn't tell my advisor I was working on this or anything like that, And I think people didn't really understand exactly why we're doing it. And our reviews for the paper were like, yeah, sure, but results are not that surprising, that kind of stuff, right? And then once her work came out, and I exactly agree with what Meredith was saying. I always say this in my talk in the hierarchy of knowledge talk as well, where the reason it has impact is because she made sure that, she didn't just go from paper to paper or something like that. She did everything: spoken word, art exhibition, the documentary that Shalini has, activism. So that was in that clip that you're talking about. Joy and Deb was the first author of the follow-up paper, had a follow-up paper, and one of the things it showed was that Amazon's recognition tool could have similar biases to what we showed in the first paper. And that wasn't even the central point of the paper, but that came out, and VP after VP was attacking them, and my co-lead Meg Mitchell and I spent like a whole month assembling a rebuttal for what they were saying. We had all of these academics, write a letter, and we had a point-by-point rebuttal and spent a month, and then we put it out in the press, and we wrote an anonymous letter, and I was worried I might get fired for it. I told my manager, I was like, well, I'm going to do this. So, and he recommended that we don't put our names, author names, because he didn't want it to be a Google versus Amazon thing or whatever. He said, you can just have like a letter of signatories, So what needed to happen? We all needed to support each other. I had to have a supportive manager. We had to have support of the community. By then, Joy had, Algorithmic Justice League. We had Black AI, which, I remember a few years ago, before Deb was a superstar, she sent me an email. She was like, yeah, back before, she sent me an email. She was like, I would have I came when I found Black and AI at NeurIPS, I was ready to leave that whole industry, tech industry, like what Meredith said, right? So many things had to happen, but I think we are at least in a place where we sort of can survive and kind of support each other and draw inspiration from the people who came before us. But it is such a constant struggle. It's like a constant swimming upstream. But I do see more awareness, and I do see a lot more involvement of, people like the ACLU and many other civil society groups, which I didn't see a few years ago.
Well, that's actually the question I want to incorporate in one of the audience questions. There's a scene in Coded Bias where you see, Joy actually reaching some bipartisan agreement, which was pretty interesting with AOC and Jim Jordan. Probably don't agree on much, but that was a fascinating scene of the film. And then having Kathy O'Neill visit as well. So one of the questions says, are we seeing more activism from young people with the release of this film? And the social dilemma. Any tips on starters and best practices for this type of activism? So, Meredith, do you have any thoughts about this? What changes are you seeing, especially around young people with your involvement at NYU and other individuals that you're connected with?
So one of the things that I direct people to is actually the resource list on Shalini's Coded Bias website. She's done a really good job of kind of putting up a reading list and also a list of organizations who are doing really good work in this area. I would point to Joy's organization, the Algorithmic Justice League. I would point to Tim Neat's organization, Black in AI. Kathy O'Neill, as you mentioned, who is amazing in the film, has an algorithmic auditing firm called Orca Risk Management. There is Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression. Sophia runs a research center, C2I2, out of UCLA. They have a lot of great resources. Basically, just reading your way through the works of the awesome women in the film is a great way of getting started.
Yeah.
Amy Webb's book, Big Nine, is really important. Zainab's book, Twitter and Tear Gas. Like, one of the things that was so fun about being in this film is that these are some of the other women in the film are some of the women who I admire most in the industry, who I would most like to hang out with at any given moment. And so it's really it's a pleasure.
And not only just the women you admire most, I can tell from All Things Human, we get a lot of email requests about who we should have on our live stream, and all the names, the people featured in that film, Coded Bias, are all people that they're heavily influential, especially for a college grad student audience. So I see it from my perspective how important this is. So Timnit, I'd love to kind of bring you in on this. What are you seeing on your end in terms of the change in activism?
I always think that the undergrads are ahead of everybody else in, let's say, in an academic institution. So like when I visit or something like that, they always tell me they're trying to have reading groups or some sort of class, but the professors are just not, like
They should come take my class.
So that's what I was gonna say. Was one of my advices, or I don't think that's a word. But my advice, would be, a lot of times what happens is some of these classes are not offered as, let's say, if you're in computer science or in engineering, as an engineering class. I would demand that these classes are offered, and they should be required classes, in my opinion. For anybody who's going to get a degree and go, to any company or whatever and work on these types of models. And so Nikki Washington has a class at Duke that I really, really like. Sorry, my dogs are about to go crazy. Stop, please. Sorry. And Ruha Benjamin has a class at Princeton too. Meredith has one. And so these classes, these classes should be required. That's one thing I would say, because I feel like a lot of the undergrads are trying, but the institution is way behind the times. And another pattern I'm seeing that I do not like is that there are these classes. Sorry, guys.
Well,
your dog doesn't like this pattern either.
No, what they're doing is they're fighting for the couch space.
No, I think your dogs want to join in on the fight for a better tech future. So we welcome everyone and all animal life.
One other thing I was gonna say, I really was gonna make this. Oh yes, a pattern I really don't like is that now they've decided we need ethics, but we need philosophy. And so they're having these classes with philosophy, which is the most white male centric, discipline after probably more than computer science. What you need is not that. Well, we need people who do intersectional studies, feminist studies, race and gender studies, queer studies, and indigenous studies, disability studies. That's the kind of stuff I want to see in classes. So please, not this, two white men teaching, one of them being philosopher or tech ethics and one of them being computer science. That's not what I think the way forward is.
Well said. So Shalini, I'd love to bring you in on this, especially with the activism. I know, again, with the release now of Coded Bias, it seems to be that you're kind of tying this in, seeing this intersection of AI with civil rights, maybe this new kind of algorithmic civil rights. So I'd love to hear more about what you're hoping for that, right? This kind of the digital rights that you're pushing.
Yes, we're launching just a framework. You can sign it at codedbias.com/sign, and it's a declaration of data rights as human rights. And we don't have any laws here in the States. And, as I said in the opening, this is really what I hope is that it gives people a basic framework to talk about this in a way that draws the link between data and civil and human rights. And so the Declaration of Basic Rights, a lot of it was informed by lawyers in the UK who are data rights lawyers and pulled from language from the GDPR. But what I hope is that people will start to educate themselves so that we can start to push for policy on these issues. We just need some legislation. And I think for me, I'm sort of a little bit pragmatic. Like, I really am hopeful about a lot of these, about local legislation being the way that sort of tips the scale towards a federal ban. Like I'm very heartened by Massachusetts passing a state ban on facial recognition technology. First you saw cities, the first, and ironically, the most technologically the technology hubs were the first to ban facial recognition.
Because they know it so well. They know what it can do.
So well, San Francisco, Oakland, Cambridge, and others. And then you saw the local then go to the first state. And for the first time now, we have, thanks to the work of Timnit and Joy and Deborah Raji, who put their academic reputations on the line to prove that this stuff had racial bias. And because of engaged citizenry in the streets, I feel like we have the first also ban on the table of federal use of facial recognition, which would, I believe, extend to ICE and the FBI. So I think it would be a real step forward. I think there's also some legislation in California on the table. And my understanding is, like, whenever someone gets rights in this space, it sort of creates a culture shift. Like I'm of the belief is that it sort of happens in waves like that. And so I think, like, I know, like, Illinois has some legislation, and companies will not want to make separate legislation for each state. And I feel like if we can just start to pass local legislation and local bans, and those of us who work at universities can pass, you see students banning facial recognition on their campuses, and I feel like there are all kinds of ways to engage. And then the other thing is, like, there's just amazing organizations doing fantastic work in this field. You can support an organization like Black and AI, or the Algorithmic Justice League, or the ACLU, Mi Gente, so many others that are doing just incredible work in the field on so many levels, from culture to legislation and strategic. So I really think, but for me as a culture maker, I feel like I want to make science fiction. I want people to understand this stuff. I want us to, for me, the big cultural shift is around education and around, I had fear when I first started. I didn't know if I was going to misuse the language of this. And you don't know if you're going to be embarrassed about, like, when you engage with something you don't have advanced degrees with. And I think the more that we can empower ourselves with some basic vocabulary to understand the technology that impacts our lives, all of us, and that knowledge shouldn't be in the hands of the few.
Yeah.
In order for us to we've seen through these crises the importance of science education and how we have to communicate it so that we can translate that into responsible public policy and govern. And I think that is why I'm so grateful to this panel for, like, sort of being those bridge people who have such integrity in the science, but then also can translate it. Be bridge people to translate that, and to activists who then take it and you hear Trenae, you guys were so brave in doing that. And of course, 3 major corporations then changed their complete policy towards sale of facial recognition to law enforcement, game changing. But also that people like Trenae Moran, who, when her landlord was trying to install facial recognition, drew from Joy's research because she could read it. It wasn't some scientific method where, some jargon where she couldn't read it. Joy translated it in a way where activists could then use that to empower themselves against predatory practices. So I feel like that's kind of the bridge that we need to make if we're going to make change.
Terrific. And then you mentioned earlier kind of the need for legislation on a state or local level. It's one of the questions that I love to incorporate. I think it's also kind of reminds me of some of the work, Meredith, that you had, especially your recent New York Times op-ed, where you talked about the incident in the UK around algorithms kind of tilting people and affecting their trajectory for some of their testing. The question is, are you familiar with the bills introduced in New York and California to regulate the use of algorithmic employment decisions? And do you think these bills are a step in the right direction? So we're talking about algorithmic employment decisions.
Ooh, I have so much to say about this. I don't know if I should say it because I might start talking and use up the entire rest of the panel. Here's what I will say. I am here. I am ready to write AI regulation. I am ready to draft the policy. Just like, I'm here. I'm ready. I want to do it.
Good.
And we're at this really interesting point where everybody agrees that we need regulation. Even Facebook has a post up on their blog saying, here's our proposed regulation for, combating misinformation. Now, I don't actually think that we should let Facebook write the regulation, because tech companies regulating themselves is what got us into this mess in the first place. So I think that people who are not in the position to make billions of dollars should maybe write the regulation. So yes, Shalini's absolutely right that regulation is what we need. What's going on in California is a mess. Uber and Lyft just spent, I think it was billions of dollars in order to quash a measure that would have made Uber and Lyft drivers considered employees. Instead, they spent these many millions and used their market power to keep the drivers classified as contractors. I personally think this is terrible because these are clearly employees and deserve the protections that employees get.
I guess, Tiffany, do you have anything else to add on that about what you're seeing on the legislative side? Because I know a hot topic of conversation is always the disconnect sometimes between our legislative body, which tends to skew a little bit older. There's obviously the famous scene that we had a couple of years ago with Zuckerberg, right, having to explain that he sells ads. Right, so that's more of a comical scene, but that's obviously a topic of discussion, right? How can we maybe bridge that divide if we need more legislation?
I mean, but there are plenty of other people who can be drawn upon, like Meredith was saying, who are not those two extremes. So I think there are so many stakeholders that the people renting. Who were, the Brooklyn rent, the landlord, what Shalini was talking about. I can't so, those people should be at the table, right? I oftentimes it's the, the either people in civil society representing somebody or academics or people in industry or something. I really want people who are actually affected by these things, who know firsthand how it's been harming them, to be at the table when these kinds of legislations are crafted. Sometimes what I hear is there could be an opposite effect. Like, for example, I don't know if this is true, but I remember reading somewhere when GDPR came out, the stocks of large companies like Facebook and Google went up, and the ones of smaller companies went down, because there are larger companies have more resources to comply. But I think that's kind of something that it doesn't mean there shouldn't be regulation, right? But that is something that should be also figured out in conjunction, right? You shouldn't be punishing people with smaller number of resources while trying to curb the influence of the huge companies. So yeah, and so I don't believe that tech companies should be writing.
Okay.
I don't think anybody from Google is watching right now. I don't know, but I
definitely watching. Who are we kidding?
So actually, there was a question from the audience that was saying, how can we, tech companies are usually looking at profit.
Yeah.
And how can we educate them about AI ethics, or some question similar along those lines? And so sometimes I give the example of when it came to face surveillance, right? At Google, they hadn't put out a general purpose face recognition system. And they hadn't put out a general purpose, automatic gender recognition system. And that was good because it means that they didn't have to stop doing it later, right? But so what are you but when you're making the case, you're like, well, you're not saying like, oh, we launched X, Y, and Z, we made X, Y, and Z. You're trying to show, well, these other companies are doing that. But so because of our work, you were able not to have to do this. So we try to make points like that. But I think journalists they play a big role in this space because unfortunately, a lot of tech companies, the way they see what's important, what's not important is like what has PR attention, what has, pressure from the outside. It can be very hard sometimes to tell people that something is really important. They should spend some time on it. Right now, I'm really worried about hate speech and misinformation in the Ethiopian context and then the larger African context. Mm-hmm. Which none of these tech companies, I mean, they say they care, but when you look at the amount of resources being put, it's truly minuscule, right? And so when there's a lot of, PR on something like that, it has a huge effect internally as well. So yeah, I think that's sort of what
well, Timney, you mentioned the scene from Coded Bias that deals with kind of facial recognition in the kind of housing portion, I believe, is in Brooklyn. And what struck me about that, which seems to be a common theme of Coded Bias and other work in this space, is that there's often a major gulf between the individuals who are developing and deploying technology and the first communities that oftentimes are impacted by this technology. I believe it was Kathy O'Neill in the film who basically points out that this is an issue of a major power imbalance. So Meredith, I'd love to hear from you on this. How can we bridge that divide? Because it seems like oftentimes you have a community that doesn't have a voice in the development and deployment of technology. And oftentimes the individuals who are actually creating it are never actually impacted by it. So even if you think about it from an employment standpoint of how it's being utilized, let's say facial recognition to do job interviews, which is something that is happening. It's oftentimes not the white collar type of worker who is going to have that deployed on them.
So one of the things that I write about is an idea that I call technochauvinism. The idea that technology is superior, that technological solutions are superior to others. And what I would argue is that instead of a techno-chauvinist, pro-technology all the time bias, we should ask, what is the right tool for the task? Right? Sometimes the right tool for the task is a computer. Sometimes it's not. It's not a competition. So I think what happens inside technology companies is that there is this techno-chauvinist mindset, this idea that, okay, we're going to privilege the technological solution and we're going to privilege the knowledge of the people who create the technology, right? And so people who are going to be affected by the technology do not have a seat at the table. So that's why the voices in the film of the folks who live in the housing project where they tried to roll out facial recognition are so powerful, because these tenants fought back and they said, this is not an appropriate technology. We don't want this in our houses. And they were absolutely right, by the way, to object to it. So I think what we need to do is we need to start by giving a wider variety of people a seat at the table. We need more diverse teams creating technology. And we also need technologists to value multiple ways of thinking. We need them to value intersectionality. We need them to talk to people in affected communities as they're designing technology. So as part of the product design process, go out and talk to the people who are going to not just be the consumers, the users, but the people who say are going to be evaluated by automated hiring interview systems, right? So using facial recognition in hiring is a pretty bad idea.
So now, since looking at the time, we want to get to some of the hopeful parts of this or potential solutions. So when we look at this issue of AI bias, algorithmic bias, is this something that can be solved? I mean, Meredith, you talk about how our own kind of bias that we would have as individuals gets kind of embedded into this system. So we'd love to hear from both of you about if this can be solved, and if so, what we can do moving forward. So Meredith,
You want to take this one?
Or Timmy, yeah.
Okay, so wait, I'll quickly say, you know, just to follow up on what Meredith was saying, there is in the tech industry, so now this has become something that a lot of people know about, you know, algorithmic fairness, and it's become a whole field that people from a lot of people are working on. Now there is a kind of a rush to develop a solution. So it's like debiasing something or an algorithmic solution to the algorithmic bias problem, right? And I'm not saying, you know, sometimes there are techniques that need to be, it doesn't mean that there should be no, you know, algorithmic kind of mitigations, right? But that's just the rush, because that is the hierarchy of knowledge that we're operating in. So what we need is a much more foundational change. And when I think about it, honestly, I do think it's definitely there's hope. I mean, I'd be too much of a pessimist if I thought that, you know, it wasn't. But in my opinion, there's many things that need to be done. Like there's a huge foundational shift in thinking that needs to be done in terms of cross-disciplinary work and who is at the table and who's not. There's a paper I wrote with a historian where we say that there should be a discipline on data, just data itself, you know, and with an interdisciplinary sort of a specialty on that. So some specifics that we give, but at the same time, it's not just about like racial and gender diversity into a specific structure that can be sexist and racist, right? Because women in power can be sexist and Black people in power can be racist. So there needs to be a shift in thinking and a shift in structure, a structural shift. And I don't think that comes easy, because when that structural shift is something that will really hit people in privilege in some way, they're gonna fight back, or they might not have an incentive to just, so there needs to be a huge push for this kind of structural change. I mean, I can say a lot more about that, but that's sort of how I think about this.
Well, now we're actually kind of nearing our final question, but to end us hopefully on a high note, and then I'll kick it over to Shalini for a little bit of special closing that we're going to have. But Meredith, I'll start with you, and then actually Timnit as well. If you can tell people where they can continue to follow up with your work, stay in touch with you, get involved more of this larger responsible tech movement. The question is, especially since 2020 has been a dumpster fire of a year, what are you most hopeful for, especially with everything that you do? Because a lot of times it can seem like a Black Mirror episode. Shalini, you mentioned your sci-fi kind of roots. So Meredith, we'll start with you. What are you looking at everything you do, people that you're in touch with? What are you most hopeful and optimistic about?
I am most hopeful and optimistic about the fact that this film is out in the world. That is hands down the highlight of recent recent months. So the film is out. The election is over. There is, I pray there is hope on the horizon. Resources that I turn to when I have to think about, okay, what are the technology, where is the hope in the technological world? I have a couple of places that I turn. One is the new discipline of public interest technology. So this is people creating technology in the public interest. It's not necessarily technology that's going to scale. It's not necessarily technology that's going to make $1 bajillion. It's just technology that's going to make people's lives better. I love recently the COVID tracking project they're doing a really amazing job of gathering COVID data from all of the states and centralizing it and making it available and interpreting it so that anybody can understand what is going on with the COVID pandemic and understand the scale of the devastation.
Mm-hmm.
I would again point to the Algorithmic Justice League. I would point to Black in AI. I would point to Kathy O'Neill's work with Orca. There is also a woman named Ruman Chowdhury who's doing a new platform called Parity that is a platform for evaluating algorithms. And I am inspired by a lot of work going on in the algorithmic fairness community. Some of it is the same old, but some of it is truly groundbreaking. So I think there's definitely hope on the horizon.
I'm glad. And Meredith, if people want to stay in touch with you, where would you like them to go?
I am always available at meredithbroussard.com, and I'm at Mayor Broussard on Twitter.
Terrific. Tim Neat, love to hear about your optimistic, outlook.
I'm so happy that Meredith went first because I was going to say that, I want to start by saying this week has been particularly difficult for me because I'm an Eritrean ethnically who was born and raised in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is sliding into a very dangerous civil war that has just gotten completely out of hand. So, on top of everything else like that, just seeing that this year has been difficult because what I was super hopeful, I had a lot of hope before that because, for example, one of the things we did was we had convinced a major international AI conference to be held in an African country for the first time. And that was going to be in Ethiopia in April. And because of COVID, we weren't able to do it. But then so seeing this now has been devastating. But I am inspired by everything that Meredith just talked about. One of the organizations I would add is also Data for Black Lives. And so a lot of times what happens in this space, it's kind of like international development all over again, where a bunch of white people, especially white men, sit around and talk about Black people and how they can help them. And it's the most just irritating thing for me. So this happens with NGOs. They're all like well paid, and all that. And you go to a conference and they're all talking about Somalia and there's not a single Somalian in there, right? So it's something like that. And what Shalini has done is the complete opposite of that, and centering the voices of the people who are affected by this and also the people at the forefront of working on this. And that is extremely inspiring because that's what we need to continue to do. And it's not, I don't believe in this whole global change. It's each of us have to work on local change because local change is much harder because you can actually achieve something and measure what you have achieved, right? And then it percolates, right? So what Shalini was saying about laws, like local laws percolate and then they kind of spread, right? And so each of us kind of advocating in our local system is what I'm inspired by. And so, yes, and so Coded Bias has been a highlight. I'm amazed by what it has accomplished, and everybody's talking about it. Everybody's watching it. All of the people who didn't know anything about ethics or anything like that are watching it. They're having watch parties, screening it, and so I'm super inspired by that. And if you want to follow me, I'm at Twitter. I'm Timnit Gabru at Twitter. My website is not super up to date, but blackanai.org for Black and AI related stuff. And you can also follow Black and AI at Twitter, and we have a Facebook page as well. So we try to highlight things that are relevant to the Black and AI community.
Wonderful. Timnit, Meredith, thank you for coming on today's conversation. I'm your host, David Ryan Polgar with All Tech is Human. Check us out at alltechishuman.org. Shalini, I'm going to kick it over to you to close out this incredible discussion. And then again, thank you for everybody who joined us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you so much to the panel and David for orchestrating this. What I want to say is that my film is about this radical kind of inclusion and about bringing more voices to the table. And that is the thing that I'm most proud of. And what I've learned is that kind of radical inclusion is not just something that's like good for the pictures. It makes us more competitive in more innovative in the industries of the future, and it expands our imagination about what the world can be.